why did you feel like this book was needed?
Well, you know, over the last decades and decades, trashing government, and particularly the federal government, has become something of a blood sport. The media loves it, politicians who are out of office love it. Everybody looking for somebody to blame finds blame in government. And yet, a lot gets done well. Planes fly without crashing into each other, Social Security checks get issued. I mean, there are a lot of things that really get done well by the government and by the federal government in particular. So I was interested in what makes the difference. What is it that people or organizations in the government do that makes a difference between a really great result like the 2010 decennial census, which was major successful, and a problem like the Obama website launch, you know? What is it that people do when they are having successes that those of us who may not be successful in the federal government or students studying the federal government can learn from? And the book addresses the difference at a level of actual activity that people do. The other thing it addresses is the difference between doing it in an orderly way versus being haphazard. So I've chosen to take the various activities and organize them so that how do you create a good offense like any winning team has to do? How do you execute a play well in the federal environment? And then how do you play defense well, because there's always people who are going to attack you. The third reason for the book is even though there are many, many, many books about government and government performance, almost all of them are about sort of broad transformations. None of them are about how do you do better in the government that we have and the government that the Founding Fathers gave us as we have it now. So this addresses some pretty specific things that students and public policy people can look at, that people do well in order to be successful.
And why are you the one who should write this book?
Well, I spent, of my 45 or 6 year career, I spent the first 18 to 20 years in the government. I started as a lowly GS7 and worked my way up. I was a charter member of the Senior Executive Service, eventually became a leader in the executive branch, moved to the legislative branch, and I have experience as Assistant Controller General at GAO, which looks at government effectiveness. And then I left the government and spent the last 25 years of my time in consulting to government entities. And so I've sort of seen, I like to say I've sort of seen it from both sides of the table, from the perspective of how it feels to try to run something well and what works and doesn't work. And I have to say I had my fair share of things that didn't work very well, and I learned from them. And then I also launched and ran a number of consulting practices which helped government entities be successful. At the end of my career, I felt like there was a lot there that I had learned that was worth sharing. And so I think I'm well balanced and have some insights that people can learn from.
And let's say you're in an elevator with somebody who's new to management in the federal government. So you've got a short period of time, but you want to give them 3 main pieces of advice for what they should really kind of be aware of, or what they should kind of be on the lookout for.
Okay, one, the first determinant of success is motivating your people based on the mission they have in the government. Everybody who gets into the government wants to do something worthwhile, and you can appeal to that even with the most difficult motivation challenge. That's item number 1. Item number 2 is be really aware of who the most powerful stakeholders are for your program. Who are the interest groups who can help you or kill you, who are the politicians who are going to fund you or not, and make sure you design whatever you are designing to give the most powerful players the most result out of your program. The third thing, and especially for political appointees who are newly managing, is listen to the career civil servants. Listen to the people who have been there. You don't always have to do what they want, but the failure to listen as opposed to just deciding, I'm going to do what the president wants me to do, is I found was one of the key determinants of problems later. So that would be the 3 things that are most important.
Now, what advice do you give in the book that you think might be surprising to someone who's a current federal employee or a federal manager?
At the top of the list is take risks. There are many risks that are rewarded, and if you don't take some, in today's world of increasing expectations, the government's capability will go backwards if you don't take a few risks. There are rewarded risks. There are also unrewarded risks. You don't want an unrewarded risk is one where you want to like payments that are erroneous. You don't want them. But if it takes a little work to get an application up and running that veterans can use better, take that risk because it'll move the program forward and move you forward. And it's amazing how positive the reaction is to successful risks. And there's a lot in the book about how to do that. The second is always be able to pivot. A basketball player never goes just one direction. He or she plants the foot and can turn. In the federal and overall government realm, standing your ground and defending where you are is never a very successful strategy. You run into a problem, pivot to the left, pivot to the right. And I think that people forget and they get caught up in trying to defend what they're doing as opposed to deciding time for a 20-degree change in direction, time to make a change. The third thing that actually came out of the research for the book is always look for a threat or a crisis that you can use to get resources for your program. There are far too many demands for far too few dollars in the federal government, and so you get the resources by having some imminent threat. And one of the things I address is if there is, like in Y2K, like when we got to the end of the year 2000 and there was concern that all the computers would fall down and stop, making sure everybody understood what the threat was the important key to that. So a third thing that I think people would be surprised at is how much time the book spends on making sure you can identify your need to an imminent threat.
What are the biggest challenges that a manager faces that are unique to work in the federal government as opposed to the corporate or nonprofit sector?
Well, the top one is the media fishbowl. Everything you do in the federal government becomes newsworthy, especially if it doesn't go well. If it goes really well, you're fortunate if anybody notices. But if it doesn't go well at a corporation, it doesn't become front page news. We had a very recent example where one person saw somebody with a gun at a particular Air Force base, reported it as the person was supposed to, and turned out not to be a threat, and now it's on the front page, and everybody's trying to figure out what went wrong. Okay, so one of the first special impediments is the media fishbowl, and of course you deal with that by learning how to deal with the media and being forthright and coming forward with the right story when the media gets involved. The second one goes all the way back to the beginning of our nation. The dispersed power, the fact that we have three branches of government, and they are deliberately fractured so that, and the founding fathers decided they were going to create a federal government that couldn't do anything with a lot of power. They didn't want a lot of power. So they made it very, very difficult for any individual or any program to get something done across the entire government. You've got to get cooperation across all three. And that's the second thing that is really special to doing the work in the federal government. Of course, the answer to how you deal with that is in the fact that you have to learn a special set of skills about how do you get everybody into the fold, how do you build alliances between those types of different parts of the government. The third and thing that a lot of people concentrate on is how difficult it is to get innovation in the federal government, because there is such a high penalty to being wrong. People are afraid to innovate. And that's a challenge that you don't have in a lot of corporate settings, especially since there's an economic benefit to finding something that's innovative. Solution or the approach to innovation is to create pockets of protected innovators and to find those innovators and to use them. And I talk some about that in the book. There's a concept called skunk works that is a very interesting way to protect innovators, and the name goes back to the fact that the originator of it put a big skunk on the front so that people would stay away and not get in their way while they were innovating. The fourth thing I guess I would identify that's a really difficult challenge in the federal government, and more so than in private sector, is just the time it takes to get a contract done, the time it takes to get a technology launched. Right now, it takes longer to get any of those things done than the life cycle of the particular technology you may be putting in. And so one of the things that is successful about people who can accomplish that well is they figure out how to do contracts and technology in smaller chunks so that you can pivot when the technology becomes becomes obsolete or when there's a new technology. And how do you accomplish success in all of those areas is really one of the things that motivated me to do the book.
Do you have any favorite anecdotes from your time in the federal government?
I have lots of favorite anecdotes. Only some of them are ones I can tell you, but many of them are also in the book. One has to do with a table like this. When I was Assistant Controller General, I would accompany the Controller General to testify before the Congress. I was the Chief Operating Officer of GAO, and they would inevitably have a lot of things, the chair of the committee and all the rest of the members and senators, that they wanted GAO to do differently or review this program, not program, and then they would attack sometimes what I was doing. And I remember time after time sitting next to Chuck Boucher, the Controller General, leaning forward to defend GAO and feeling his knee up against my knee, just occasionally jamming it, occasionally just putting it right, and asking him later on a number of occasions, you know, Congressman X was not correct in saying what they said about it. And then and Chuck would explain to me that you never want to give the congressman or the senator something while the cameras are rolling that could show that he or she was wrong. It's not about you. It's not about me or the Controller General. It's about the elected official needing to show his constituents or her constituents that they're on top of it. And, you know, we'll fix the problem with the staffer. And that little set of vignettes stayed with me for a long, long time, because it's emblematic of what I address in my oversight chapter, which is don't fight. Don't fight with oversight people you can't win. Figure out how to make them the winner. Much better strategy. The second one happened with a staffer who I will call Ted, not really. When I was running the federal welfare programs for a brief period of time, our regulations were horrible. And my bosses wanted us to lay off the TEDs who were working on the regulations. And we started to think about doing that. But it was too late for one particular regulation that had to get done in 2 days. And so I called in one or two, and these were the days before laptops, so we got out the scissors and we started redoing the regulations. And I became aware of the fact that this was the first time the people who were writing regulations were actually reviewing draft, redoing them time and time again. And I finally stopped. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. We were going to get done by 9 o'clock the next morning when we had to do it, and then we'd all go, you know, maybe, I don't know if we were going to get a beer or go to sleep or whatever. And I finally said, well, you all look like you haven't done this before. And it turns out that the way they were doing regulations is by typing them up and sending them to the Federal Register and putting them out, and not reviewing draft after draft after draft. So, I mean, it's a little anecdote that was really important to me because it taught me never to presume that people who were not doing a good job couldn't do a good job. To always think about how to mentor, how to teach, spend a little time doing that. And in the end, they did well. They did fine. Nobody had ever taken the time with them to do that. And I'll share a third one in which I was the subject of it. So one administration changes to the next. I happened to be in a political position. I was still career, but I had been asked to step up to be acting Associate Commissioner of Social Security. And the new people came in, and I moved over, and I was working in the Office of Planning and Evaluation, and we issued a lot of controversial press releases. And the new press director came in looking for the assistant secretary, and she couldn't find him, so she found me, and I explained the reason we released it, and the new administration hated the rule. And the last words I remember her saying was, "You are the worst excuse for a civil servant I have ever heard or seen of. I will have your job." And she left. And she left me I was at GS 15, I think. She left me shaking, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to call a lawyer or to call my wife or to pack my office. And my boss sent me to talk to the assistant to the new secretary. Joe Califano was the secretary, and I still remember Ben Heineman was his assistant. And he said, "Oh, that's just," and I'm not going to name the name, but that's just Bob or Eileen. Nobody listens to Eileen when she's trashing civil servants. She just does that for fun." And then he paused and he said, "But you know, it might be a good idea if you and your boss figured out how to let us know before you sent those things out." So, a couple of interesting anecdotes that made an impression on me. I think that last one taught me that anytime somebody's beating you over the head, it may be not necessary to beat back. It may be a good idea to go around.
What's something that federal managers should really not do?
First of all, don't look, sound, or be defensive. Do not fight against oversight. It's part of the process. If you, and it hurts often, if you give in to the understandable desire to defend and push back, you simply embolden the oversight entity to prove that they're right and that you're not. So, first not to do is don't spend a whole lot of time trying to defend or being defensive. I phrase it as being, the better oversight strategy is play ball, play smart, and play nice, which is offensively play ball, meaning go and talk to them, talk about what you're doing, incorporate what you can, and make it your win. And there's more about it, there's more detail about how to do some of those things. But item number one is don't fight with oversight, you can't win. It's like fighting with the media, you will not win. The second thing that managers should really not do is allow others around them to define their personal or organizational goals. Okay? Part of the way I structure the book is that goals and who decides what your goals are can be a very important determinant of whether you and your program are considered successful, you and your organization. So, because the Founding Fathers created a very diffuse power environment, that allows you to be a player in deciding what your goals are. Even if it's different from what other people say, don't give in to the tendency to be pressured into goals that you can't agree to. That's the first thing. And I recognize it's often easier to say than to do. Even in our personal life, we have to negotiate goals. But the person who states what their output and outcome goals are owns the first stage in deciding whether something is successful or not. Third would be, before you take a position, understand where the powerful politicians are on it, especially in an environment like we've come to be used to in Washington, where there's always a partisan spin to something. Avoid the desire to take a position before you go and talk to the stakeholders, the interest groups, the politicians. You don't have to do everything everybody wants, but know where all the bodies are buried before you can do that. And avoid the tendency to be out there first, bold, and then to discover that the chairman of your appropriations committee already said he wouldn't fund what you just said was the goal. Next, I guess I would say never ever delegate people motivation. In an environment where the formal people process is almost impenetrable, the most important way to get people to work together is by motivating them, and you have to do that personally. And there's a reason I call them people and not personnel. They're people. They're real people. And so you have to avoid the temptation to manage in the formal process and always manage directly face to face. The last thing I would say is just as important in your personal life as it is in the government, which is the first three things you should do before communicating as the beginning of communicating is listen, listen, and then listen some more. It's amazing to me how many leaders think that communication means outward telling people as opposed to listening and understanding what they need. So I think trying not to take too bold steps before listening a lot is something else I would say people should be careful not to do.
In the book, you mentioned the 4 dimensions of success. What are they?
Yes. Goals, and I'll expand on each one for a second. Goals, stakeholders, resources, and time frames. Okay? Each of those has 3 elements, 3 parts. And the point of the 4 goals and the 3 elements is that all of these things have to work together in order for you to get a successful program or organization. And in an environment where things change all the time, resources may change, you may have to change your goal. Okay? Your stakeholders, such as interest groups, the AARP, American Association of Retired Persons, or one of the American Veterans Association, if they change their position, then you may have to change the time frame for what you're going to do because you may need to reach more people, more veterans. So the first of the 4 is be clear on what the goals are. And the second is be clear about who your stakeholders are. There are always 3 levels of stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders internal to your organization? Who are the people who care? Is the secretary going to be able to support you, and is she an important stakeholder for your program? And then in the government broadly, in the Congress and so forth, who are the people who really matter from a stakeholder standpoint? And lastly, nationally, do you have the interest groups covered? The third one is resources, which is people, process, and technology. If you can't, if you can't get the right people to do the website, and the process will take twice as long as the deadline, then the technology is not going to save you, and you have to go back and change the goal. If you can't change the goal, you may have to change the time frames, which is the 4th of the key determinants of success. And quite simply, short term, mid-term, long term. Sometimes you can satisfy the political needs in the short term by getting the right appropriations and then achieve some other goals a year or 2. In a political environment, I tend to think of the short term as being, what does this administration need before the next congressional election, which is 18 to 24 months? In the mid-range, what does this administration need to be successful before the president has to run for re-election in 4 years? And in the long term, what do they want to accomplish over the 8 years? That is an outcome that they can do. And the reason I call them the 4 dimensions of success, even though they sometimes seem kind of self-evident, is that people forget how intimately they have to interact with one another, and they watch one thing change, like the technology isn't going to come online in time, without realizing that that requires that you go back and change people's goal or change the time frame. So that's the 4 dimensions of success. You also have to have there's a reason I call it a playbook. You also have to have, it's very complicated if you just have to do 12 things all the time. You have to organize them in such a way that you have, like any sports team or any team, that you get the right starting point with an offensive strategy, that you figure out what your strategy will be as it relates to goals and timeframes and interest groups. Then you have to have a plan to execute it, and you have to do it well. And then in why, so the book addresses the steps in these 4 dimensions to be done in areas that have to do with getting ready to have a good strategy and an offense. How do you execute well? And then, because somebody's always going to attack you, what kind of defense are you going to play? And I think that's also part. I address the 4 dimensions, but also the 3 phases.
What have been some of the biggest federal management successes?
Well, I think I mentioned a few earlier on. We like to concentrate on a lot of things that don't go well, but the 2010 decennial census was the most accurate and the most well executed, despite the fact that the technology that they started with didn't work very well, so they pivoted. And they were able to do a great decennial census by using other technologies. They had left themselves enough time. The air traffic control system, I mean, it's been beyond anybody's recollection that we have had any air traffic disasters in the borders of the United States or U.S. in the U.S. air carriers. And that's because of how well the air traffic control systems work. I like to always point to Social Security. The error rate in Social Security is so far below the error rate of any insurance company or others. They get it right, okay? And they even have reasonably good customer service responses and so forth. So that's clearly a major success. And then, although it's becoming a little more controversial these days, we haven't had a successful terrorist attack since 9/11. And those of us who have been involved in government know that that's not because there haven't been attempts, but because the government is doing a pretty good job of keeping that off. Now, other things haven't gone so well. TSA is under attack and other things like that. But keeping the homeland safe, at least at the moment, has been quite a good success. Those of us who remember what I mentioned a few moments ago, the Y2K, the year 2000 transition, in which the computer programs were all reset, had to be reset, in which the government wasn't the primary actor, but came in the last 6 to 12 months and made sure that all of the rest of the economy and all of the corporations had done the necessary thing. And everybody held their breath as the millennia changed, and it worked. It worked quite well. And there are a lot more successes than there are problems.
Who would be interested in reading this book?
So I think there's 3 layers of potential audience for the book. The inner core are the people who are running anything governmental, not just at the federal level, but across, as we say in the book, leading in the public sector at all, because a lot of the messages are transferable. Second is students. Anybody who is thinking about or taking a course in or wants to become involved in government one way or another because they're taking a public administration course or because they think they'd like to move to government, it can be a very good summary of how you get it done well and how it can be successful. And thirdly, I think there's an audience for people who find it hard to believe that it's all quite as bad as the media and the politicians characterize. The book will give you some hope that there is more being done right than the media are carrying, and that the things that people are doing to get it done right are kind of interesting and in a lot of cases motivating.